Welcome back to Dachel, Washington. I'm sitting here with Derek Chollet. Derek, thank you for joining us.
It's great to be here.
Derek, you're the co-author of a new book that looked at the era between the fall of the Berlin Wall and the attacks of September 11th. Why that era?
Well, it seemed to us, as we watched the debates unfold here in the United States about after 9/11 and the events after 9/11, and there was a sense among many Americans that 9/11 had changed everything, and in many ways history had began on 9/11. And as we looked back at the years that preceded 9/11, we were struck by how many of the debates that Americans were having about their role in the world from the mirror date of 9/11, 11/9, November 9th, 1989, and the fall of the Berlin Wall, that the debates that started on that day forward were the debates we were still having after 9/11.
So what era do we live in?
I mean, we argue in this book that in many ways, rather than thinking of it as the post-9/11 era, we still live in the post-11/9 era, in that the challenges we face in the United States faces in the world, the debates about those challenges and the way the Republicans and Democrats in the United States are responding to the changes around the world are in many ways still a manifestation of the end of the Cold War. And that 9/11 is an important day for the United States. It will be a day that every American who was living through on 9/11 will remember. And it's a day that for the families of those lost on 9/11, everything did change on that day. But when it comes to the basic contours of global politics and the challenges that America faces in the world, 9/11 was more of a wake-up call to trends that were already well underway on that day, and in many trends that began with the end of the Cold War.
Let's talk more specifically about those trends. What are the most important of those trends, and how did they impact on American politics and policymaking?
I mean, there are several. I mean, one is the rise of non-state actors, which of course has been a huge focus of American foreign policy since 9/11.
What do you mean by non-state actors?
Well, in other words, terrorist groups, organizations that don't necessarily have a capital or a foreign ministry or a government. And I think after the Cold War, which was of course the Cold War was this confrontation of states and blocks of states. And what Americans struggled with after the Cold War, and this was a struggle that began under George H.W. Bush, President Bush's father, continued under Bill Clinton in the Clinton years, and I think in many ways has framed the struggle of George W. Bush and his administration, is how we understand how the world is changing and how states may matter less and non-state actors matter more, and how American foreign policy tries to confront these challenges, where we in many ways in the United States are still structured to deal with a world in which states are the primary actors, and as non-states, as terrorist groups or currency traders in Asia and elsewhere become more important to the future of America and indeed the world, it's presented a challenge for the government and also for intellectuals who are trying to understand these worlds.
Don't states still matter?
Absolutely. No, states do matter, but it's the balance of trying to understand how states matter versus non-states. What we saw during the years that we describe in this book, the 1990s, were policymakers in the United States struggling with problems that were emanating within states. It wasn't the idea of one state invading another state. That was sort of your classic confrontation that in many ways, that was the Persian Gulf War in 1990 and 91. What we were dealing with in the United States, what the world was dealing with during these years, and we're still dealing with today, were problems of states disintegrating, of ethnic groups within states being oppressed by a majority group, by non-state actors or those who were not under the control of a government or a security force within states like we had in Afghanistan prior to 9/11, in fact still today, operating and being able to project power and do great harm from within states. So it was a struggle not just for America, but also in many ways for the international system.
And how did, or maybe still do, our two major parties, Democrats and Republicans, look at this set of issues and offer solutions?
Yeah, well, it's been a struggle for both parties. And what we try to do in this book is to describe for people how the struggle is not just something of the George W. Bush years or a post-9/11 situation. It's actually a struggle that both Democrats and Republicans, liberals and conservatives have been grappling with since the end of the Cold War. I mean, the Cold War had created modern liberalism and modern conservatism, right? And therefore, it makes sense that with the end of the Cold War, it presented great challenges and in many ways opportunities for liberals and conservatives in the United States. And what we try to do in this book is trace how Democrats and Republicans responded to the events of these years, and then we hope it explains in many ways the debate that many have been watching unfold in the United States between Democrats and Republicans on foreign policy since 9/11, and the debates we'll watch over the next few months leading up to our presidential election, and the choices that a new president, either President McCain or Obama, is going to face in January moving forward.
When I, and I think many viewers, think of the decade you write about,
Right.
approximately a decade,
Yeah.
two phrases stand out in our mind.
Mm-hmm.
One is the end of history,
Yep.
and the other is the clash of civilizations.
That's
To what extent do these phrases accurately or inaccurately reflect the world the way you and your co-authors?
It's a very good question, and what we try to do in the book is in many ways tell an intellectual history of the debates that policymakers and outside analysts and thinkers were having about America's role in the world and how that world itself was changing. And the end of history is in many ways reflective of the 11/9 day and the fall of the wall. And there was a sense, that Francis Fukuyama had made famous that in arguing the end of history, that in a sense the great struggles of global politics were over with the end of the Cold War. That history in many ways had ended, and that America could go and focus on other things, that the world was basically heading into a sort of modern democratic direction, and that the United States could focus on, for example, things at home. And many conservatives actually at the time took the end of history argument to say we don't have to care about foreign policy as much. And by the way, Democrats did too. And there was a sense in the early 90s that foreign policy could take a back seat in the United States to more domestic issues. And just a few years later, you had Samuel Huntington talking about the clash of civilizations and actually making a counter-argument to the end of history. And his argument, I think it resonated with many people in the days after 9/11 and still today, that in fact, actually the world still was there was a cleavage and a fault line between, sort of the modern world and what he was describing as kind of a world that resonated around Islam. And I think there's obviously a huge debate about the clash of civilizations during the 1990s. We talk about some of that in the book and how the roots of those debates, in many ways, were then playing out in the discussions and controversies of the post-9/11 years.
And you also, in your book, you refer very specifically to the discussion around the war on terror. And you refer to it as a failure of the model of referring to this era as the war on terror.
Right.
Explain that.
Well, in many ways, the effort to sort of promulgate the war on terror as the frame to look at America's role in the world was a reaction to the failure to find a frame for America's role in the world during the years after the fall of the wall. The Cold War was defined by a simple phrase, containment. And it made sense to everyone, and it was seen as sort of the overarching doctrine that explained America's role in the world. And what happened with the end of the Cold War is containment went away. The Soviet Union was gone, right? And many politicians, policymakers, intellectuals all throughout the 1990s tried in vain to come up with that new bumper sticker, that new sort of single word or phrase that would help define America's role in the world. Bill Clinton, as president, was obsessed by trying to find that catchy phrase, and he tried all sorts of iterations, from democratic enlargement to the age of hope, to the vital center, to the third way, and all of that sort of disappeared into the dustbin of history. None of us really remember those. The conservatives on the outside during the 90s looked at the failure to find that phrase and that overlying doctrine, and they saw it as a sign of weakness. That the fact is America didn't have an overriding purpose, and that was a fault of the Democrats. It was a fault of Bill Clinton specifically. And then when they came into office in 2001, there was a sense that we as a country needed to talk about doctrine, and we needed to talk about sort of a simple framework. After 9/11, they thought they had found it with the war on terror. And for many years, that was the guiding principle behind American foreign policy. And what we've seen in recent years is the war on terror as a frame has lost its luster. There's been more questions about it raised, not just among liberals or Bush's opponents, but even those, say, in the uniformed military, who say that it's not the right way to think about the struggle we face against radical Islam.
We'll come back to discuss more about the issue of the war on terror and how it affects the presidential election underway with Derek Chollet in just a moment.